Good evening. I'm Parker Drew, your host tonight for Encompass. Our guest this evening is the Reverend Paul Solomon, who has been called a modern mystic, or a psychic pastor, if you will. Reverend Solomon is currently traveling around the country teaching his very unusual methods of interpreting some information that he gets while he is in a trance of sorts. And he's here tonight to talk with us about his revelations and about some of his theories. Reverend Solomon, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
I must say that
pleasure.
in reading your book, I found it very fascinating and that you have some very interesting insights and some things. I thought to begin we might get into a little bit of your background, possibly even before you had this revelation that you had this ability, which was in 1972. Am I?
It's been 5 years.
Right. What were you doing prior to that? What was?
Well, I was a minister for 15 years. And in the ministry, of course, a lot of the things that I'm saying now, I said then in different words. Probably the basic premise of the ministry or of all religion is that man can talk to God, can ask questions, and can literally get answers. But there's a problem with religion in most of its external aspects, that there's no system for doing that. There's no method for actually getting the answer and knowing specifically what the answer is. It's sort of, you hope maybe, and so on. There's no definite response. But if you look through history, you'll find that there have been a few men in history that have come to a particular traumatic incident in their life, and suddenly, as a result of that trauma, now they have an ability. And when they ask, they get a specific answer. And essentially, that's what happened to me. I had a traumatic experience when I left the ministry. I became divorced, and that by itself is a trauma for a Southern Baptist minister, let me assure you. That's end of career and the whole thing. But it put me through quite an experience in that I not only left the ministry at that time, but I went into a period of rebellion and withdrawal and trying to go the other way for a while, and I put myself into a personal trauma, something that I had to deal with within myself, my self-appreciation, values, all of that. It's a fairly typical story. It's not that unusual if you look at lives of people who have made a breakthrough at one time or another in history. And I really believe that that needs to be studied, because it's something that happens. Almost everybody at one time or another in their life will produce a traumatic emergency situation, and I think we produce it on purpose. There's a deliberate reason for it. We can call it a dark night of the soul, and we produce this dark night of the soul because we need answers that we can't get through our normal kind of thinking. Our rational deductive conclusion process isn't sufficient. And if we get ourselves into a situation where that isn't enough, then we can break through our belief barriers and produce a new kind of thinking. That new kind of thinking, those other answers that we should be able to get anyway, are already there. But for most people, it takes a traumatic experience to experience it, to recognize it. So it's not so much a change in my belief as it's a change in semantics for me and a change in experience. I grew up knowing, believing that such a thing is possible. I never called it psychic. My dad is a Southern Baptist minister, and my granddad and my uncles all are Southern Baptist ministers, so I grew up in a very religious home, but it was a home where we believed that we could ask questions and get definite, specific answers. And that was always, of course, the work of the Holy Spirit. We never used such a term as psychic. And probably the most important thing is we never believed that it could be done on purpose. It was always an idea that you beg God, and if He likes you enough, and if you've been good enough, then He might give you an answer, and if you're lucky enough, you might recognize what that answer is. So all of those things were inadequate for me as a pastor and as a spiritual person. And I think that I had to go through the trauma of my whole life falling apart to find out that my simple religious and psychological answers weren't quite enough. They just didn't quite work. I needed to get into a position to put all of that into perspective. And I think a lot of people do. Right now, we are suggesting in educational, academic circles, in scientific circles, we're suggesting that the conclusion deductive rational process is the best way of thinking, and history proves that it isn't so. All of the great breakthroughs of history have been made by a person employing intuitive thinking. Moses is probably the greatest example of all. Moses wrote down sanitation and sterilization procedures 2,000 years before they were discovered by modern science. And even when they were discovered by modern science, they were discovered by a very intuitive little doctor in Austria. So it wasn't the rational deductive process, making an observation and drawing a conclusion. But most breakthroughs, most really big breakthroughs in history have been a man who said, I don't know the answer, and I don't even know the criteria for figuring out the answer. I have to assume that there is some kind of supernatural being, some kind of supernatural consciousness, a God, that if I ask, can give me the answer. And that's always been put in the realm of religion, therefore it is non-scientific, it is non-provable, it is non-developable, excuse my term, but that's the closest that I can think of to say it. But the truth is, if anything ever worked for anybody, including Moses or Jesus, then if we find out how they did it, if we find out the law that governed that occurrence, then we can produce the same kind of result. Mm-hmm. Now, unfortunately, because of our belief system and because of our society, we have to go through a trauma in order to produce that kind of result. But that's part of the law. The only reason we need a trauma is because we won't break through our belief barriers without the trauma. You know, for example, in an emergency situation, it's been observed many times, a woman can pick up a car off a child. Why did she have that ability then and at no other time? Because at that moment, her beliefs didn't make any difference. It didn't matter whether she knew she could or not. Even if she knew she couldn't, she did anyway, because beliefs didn't make any difference. If we can crash the belief barrier, we can produce this kind of result. And that's essentially what happened to me as a result of a traumatic experience.
Now, what you're saying, in essence, is that all of us really have the ability, if it's brought out or if it's cultured, if we're taught how to interpret these feelings, mm-hmm. then we all can get answers to God or to whatever spiritual being a person believes in.
Exactly. You know, almost all religionists are saying that this is possible. All your pastors are telling people, if you have a problem, pray, get an answer. But they seldom ever give a specific technique. How do you structure the prayer? Who do you address it to? In what kind of state of consciousness? How do you prepare yourself to receive the answer? And that's what most people leave out. The meditative process that is essentially the process of learning how, once you have asked the question, how to shut off your mind and your own egocentric thoughts that interfere with receiving an answer from an intelligent source that is greater than yourself. It is practical and it is repeatable. As a matter of fact, almost everybody uses it, usually by accident, not on purpose. For example, every doctor from time to time makes a psychic diagnosis. Most of them wouldn't admit that, but it's actually true because our medical science is still an art. It isn't exact enough that a doctor can always have exactly the information that he needs to make a diagnosis, so he has to turn to an intuitive part of his consciousness. He has to use intuition. If that intuition is trained, then he's using it on purpose and deliberately knowing what he's doing, and he's getting a psychic diagnosis. If the intuition is not trained, then he's using it as a victim, but he's still using it.
Have you had experiences along this line? Have you
Quite a lot.
You do a lot of work with psychic diagnosis.
Yes. I have worked with doctors. In fact, I lectured at Yale University this spring to the graduating medical class there, and as a result of that, the faculty and a lot of other doctors became interested in what I was saying, because I was not making any claim to them for what I can do, although I've done 1,500 medical diagnosis readings, for lack of a better term, communications from an altered state of consciousness. And they've been found to be valid, and that's what I was talking about. But my concern was to say to these doctors, you're doing it too. You just may not be doing it on purpose or as accurately, and there are ways to do it better. And as a result of that, quite a number of doctors asked and challenged me. They said, in fact, you're saying we can do this, show us how and give us specific techniques and let us see if it will work. And we did, and it does. There are quite a number of doctors in the New York area now, and since then in California. I've just come back from California, where I've worked with quite a number of health practitioners, medical professionals on the West Coast that are beginning to use psychic diagnosis in their practice as well.
Now, 20 years ago, the medical society probably wouldn't have had very much to do with you if you came out and said that you were a, well, just the word psychic alone has a lot of interesting connotations to it.
As a matter of fact, 5 years ago, they wouldn't talk with me. The change in feeling in the medical and scientific community and even the academic community has come within the past 5 years because of so many discoveries. It's becoming more and more obvious that what we're talking about is no longer superstition. It's no longer just a mystical thing. It is coming to the point that we can produce observable results. We can make a difference in what we're able to get because there's specific ways of doing it. You know, up until 5 years ago, there were people, there were psychics, there were prophets and so on, Jean Dixon, Edgar Cayce, and that gender of psychic, those were all people who were making a statement to the public that I have a supernatural spiritual gift. That is a pretty non-scientific kind of thing, saying these people have a special gift that other people don't have. And that's not acceptable to the scientific community or to the intelligent person, as a matter of fact, as I see it. Although there have been people who have displayed such gifts in history, it's time now to take the mystique out of the gift and say, anyone who's ever been a super gifted pianist was a person that worked 8 hours a day or more on polishing his technique on the piano. Anyone who is a super gifted psychic will also discover that there are specific laws that make that work, and if the person practices, turns his attention to that, study those laws, and apply them properly, he'll get that kind of results.
So there are actually techniques to be studied when you're talking about
Absolutely. Developing the psychic sense is a great deal like developing any other sense. If you wanted to develop your sense of sight to make it sharper, there are a number of things that you can do. You can exercise the muscles of the eyes. You can take a better look at comparisons between tints and shades of color. You can pay more attention to textures and to detail and to balance and form, all of those things. You can train your eye to see better. You can train your ears to hear better. The first thing you do is close your eyes to train your ears to hear better. You can train your psychic abilities by turning off the 5 senses and saying, that's not where I want to get my information from. I want to feel of this room, but I don't want to feel it with my 5 senses. I want to check my inner awareness and see how I feel about this room and what I sense. If I practice doing that and sharpen that, it's going to become a valid sense for me. It already is there. It's not that I can give anybody an ability they don't have, but I can sharpen what is there as a very natural sense.
Let's talk for a minute about the actual psychic experience that you had. This was while you were asleep, a sort of a self-induced hypnosis.
No, it wasn't self-induced originally. The first occasion when this experience occurred, I had gone for hypnotherapy. I went to a hypnosis clinic to see if hypnosis could help me through the trauma that I was going through. I felt like it could because several years ago when I was in the Army, I was at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, and I worked as a hypnotherapist there, and I had seen hypnosis help a great number of people through psychological or emotional problems, a breakup of a marriage, or one thing or another. And I wanted some help in the same sort of way. And I went to a clinic, and unfortunately, I found out that I couldn't afford it. I just couldn't afford their prices. So I spoke with a friend of mine, and I was telling him about the misfortune. I'd really like to do this, but I can't afford it. And just as a matter of conversation, he said, I hypnotized somebody once, and I said, that's good enough, let's go do it. And which wasn't very wise, as a matter of fact, but it was that little incident that triggered the experience for me. When I went under hypnosis, this thing spontaneously happened. And I really would like to clarify here that I am not suggesting that anybody use hypnosis to develop their psychic abilities, because that's not what happened. Hypnosis for me did nothing but turn off my mind. It got me out of the way so that what was already available to me could come through and make itself known. Our first impression of what happened was that a voice was speaking through me from outside. I know now that that's not what happened. As I see it, there is a source within, a higher consciousness within. There is an opportunity within to make contact with the source of self. Or as a person would say in the religious sense, I open myself to a communication with the Holy Spirit, with a higher spirit than myself. And by becoming quiet, by setting myself outside, out of the way, and by asking a question, I can get an answer within myself. Not from a spirit, not from a discarnate entity, not from something outside myself, but through attunement with the highest that is within me.
Okay, so you are asleep and you start speaking, okay, and we have a tape recorder going. What did you think when you heard the first tape that had been made while you were around? That must be a kind of a shocking experience after all, you know.
Well, first of all, I didn't hear a tape. The first time I became aware of what happened, there was no tape, just myself and the hypnotist. And when I woke up, Harry, who was the young man with me, started telling me about all of these spiritual things that I had said, and about this booming voice that was speaking through me, and we'd gotten in contact with some spirits or some business like that. And my response is, just what do you expect when you hypnotize a Baptist preacher? Don't you know that's just my subconscious coming out? It's all those years in seminary. And he's saying, no, it's not that. It was something else. It had a whole different quality. I didn't believe it, and I didn't want anything to do with it. And I avoided it for probably a week. And Harry brought a tape recorder, and I agreed to do it one more time just to find out what would happen. But that time, the second time, we asked questions that I didn't know the answer to. I had no way of even finding out the answer at that time, but the answers came in that session. And we became aware that we had tapped some kind of a source of awareness or information that knew things that I didn't know the answer to. And the answers were verifiable. And we pursued that for a little while. As a matter of fact, Harry got in touch with a reporter fairly soon. The reporter came out and said, okay, I've got something wrong with me, and I want to know if this source can tell me what it is. So I didn't know, and I had nothing to lose one way or the other. I laid down, I let Harry put me into a trance again, and we asked, what's going on in his body? What's the problem? They described the problem in detail, what it looked like in his body, what was happening, and even gave suggestions in how that could be changed or cured. So the reporter took the tape to his doctor, and the doctor was pretty amazed. He said he had not found this condition. He knew that there was pain, but he hadn't found the cause of it. But when the tape pointed out the cause, he said, okay, we can check and see if that's true. He checked, and it was true that that was the cause of the pain. It was quite an unusual incident in that the man was feeling pain in the lower left quadrant of the abdomen, and what the source pointed out as the cause of the pain was a hiatus hernia, which is high almost into the chest. And so the pain was referred. He wasn't feeling the pain where the incident was, and because of that, it had escaped diagnosis by normal means.
This psychic diagnosis could be an incredible tool, and I'm sure it is an incredible tool. But you can imagine if you say to the general public of the United States of America that here is a person that can diagnose what's wrong with you, even if doctors really haven't, that would almost be, I would think you would have been swamped by people that wanting to find out what their ailments were. Or,
well, first of all, I have been. There's no way that I can catch up with the requests for diagnosis now. In spite of the fact I don't even take requests from patients. Unless they're referred by a doctor, I don't touch it. Because my concern is that doctors begin to use their own intuitive ability in their practice. That makes sense. As a matter of fact, I'm not suggesting to doctors or anyone else that they replace their five senses or their rational process with psychic diagnosis. I'm not suggesting that anyone use that in the place of what they're already doing. I'm suggesting that if I touch something and it feels sticky, I use my eyes to validate what it is. And I'm suggesting that we use the psychic sense in the same way to validate what we are getting, or to look in there and see what I ought to test for. It's much easier, once I have a psychic diagnosis, it's fairly easy to validate that by external means. But very often, through all of the external means, I can completely miss a diagnosis unless I can find a way to tune in and find out within myself what I can see through other means, through nonverbal communication, what's going on in that body.
What about taking it a step further, psychic healing?
Well, theoretically, anything that can be communicated from me to you can be altered by the energy of that exchange. I think the best way to express it is this: the medium of the exchange of thought or the exchange of healing is love. And that means if I want to know what's going on in your mind right now, all I have to do is care more what you're thinking than what I'm thinking. I'll give up my thoughts and begin to experience yours. Now, the medium for that exchange is love or caring. Now, if I can produce that effect, if I can care for your body enough to get in it and see what you're feeling, I can also change the feelings in your body as I would change my own feelings, but only if I have developed the ability to change my feelings. Now, that may sound complicated, but what I'm trying to say is that if a doctor can learn to take charge of what's happening in his own body, if he can learn to tell himself what to think, how to feel, instead of being a victim, if he can, when he is feeling bad, change that with his own will and with his own creative ability, then he can begin to do that same thing with patients. As a matter of fact, doctors have been doing that for years. All of these things that I'm talking about are not new. They've been practiced. That is, people fondly think of the country doctor or the family doctor or whatever. The family doctor that people think fondly of is the kind of man who doesn't just use his pills or his adjustments or shots or whatever, but he uses his personality, his sense of well-being, his caring to make his patient feel better. Now, that is one of the highest forms of spiritual healing or psychic healing, not just psychological. I'm talking about a thing that goes way beyond just the psychological. I'm talking about a direct energy exchange. And that's observable enough. It's observable in tests that have been run at New York State University by a nurse there who specializes in laying on of hands healing or direct healing. And she has proved that laying on of hands can change the hemoglobin count in the blood, can change the amount of oxygen in the blood. And when you get that kind of result, you're not just psychologically making a person feel better, you're changing blood chemistry by some kind of actual energy force that is exchanged between individuals. And that can be trained.
Amazing, amazing. Psychic powers to use, let's say, for instance, then telekinesis, moving objects with the mind. Would you consider that a possibility if this was developed enough?
It's a very definite possibility. I don't teach it because I don't work with it, and I don't work with it probably because it hasn't interested me that much. It would if I got in a situation where I needed to move an object with my mind and couldn't do it any other way. I probably would get into developing that in a hurry. But so far in my work that hasn't become meaningful, except I probably should say that I think in instances where a doctor or a healer will look inside a person's body and find something, and through his desire or through his creativity changes that in that body, it has been a high form of telekinesis. He has caused something to happen at a distance by the field properties of his mind. I'm using that term in the sense of Harold Saxon Burr from Yale University, who discovered and recorded the field properties of thought and of life forms. But affecting something at a distance in that manner is, as I see it, telekinesis.
Very quickly, I'd like to get into some of the other things that you've talked about. One of the things that fascinated me was your reading on the lost continent of Atlantis. You mention in the book that you perceived flying machines and land vehicles that really made no use of wheels. I got the impression that you were talking about a machine that somehow floated or moved without the use of, it didn't contact the ground, make contact with the ground. And you mentioned a crystal that the people of Atlantis had apparently found how to use and how to utilize this power that actually kind of canceled out the power of gravity, things like that. Now, what did you think of that when you came back to your reading and heard what you had said? This is, now, you must understand, very fantastic.
Sure.
An idea like that is
amazing.
amazing.
I think probably, I've never been the kind of person who was turned on by science fiction or these kinds of far-out ideas. And so hearing that, to me, was just sort of, it didn't turn me on. It wasn't particularly exciting. It was an interesting far-out idea. But people around me got pretty excited at the concept and began to explore it and see if that sort of thing is possible and so on. Probably the most interesting result of that particular reading is that it was publicized by a publisher in Virginia Beach and got into the hands of some scientists who just happened to be working on the same concept. And when they heard this description of the vehicle, it provided for them what they needed to make a breakthrough in actually producing that kind of result. So it's actually been done in our generation. There is a man in Virginia who has created an energy receptor in the form of a crystal that can balance or can produce a resistance to gravity and make a machine levitate, I suppose is a proper word, or float or fly or whatever. But he's actually discovered the principle by which this thing can happen. Now, the fantastic thing for me is the idea that a prehistoric civilization might have had this sort of thing. But you know, this isn't the first suggestion that that might have been true. There are historical suggestions. There are suggestions in Plato's writing and even further back that suggest that flying machines existed of some sort. This is probably a more descriptive treatise on it than has been given.
I hate to interrupt. It's unbelievable, but our time is actually gone. I don't believe this, but we've only scratched the surface of this. And I would like to say that you are going to be traveling around the country, giving talks on this incredible...
Well, what we're doing primarily is making available to people who want to develop the same ability themselves a course in the development of that, not just for doctors. I've already mentioned that we've done it for quite a few doctors, but it is available for laymen as well.
And for the viewing audience, if you are indeed interested, as I am, in this subject, the book is called Excerpts from the Paul Solomon Tapes, which is available at the Something Ventured bookstore. That's the only place it's available in Green Bay. And if you would like more information about this, please write us at Encompass, care of WPNE Television, University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, Wisconsin, 54302. And we'll be happy to get you more information, which, as I say, is fascinating. I'm sorry we've run out of time. Please come back and talk with us again about this. We have a lot more that I'd like to talk with you about. Thank you for joining us. I hope it's been as interesting for you as it has been for me. Join us next time on Encompass. Thank you.
Encompass is a presentation of the Educational Communications Board, produced by the University of Wisconsin Green Bay for WPNE TV.